Hi everyone, welcome back to Unmuted, podcast for issues that remain silent that need to be unmuted, of course. So today is a very special episode with the Olympics around the corner. I think it's very important we talk about an issue that has been pretty silent, and frankly, mostly by governments, but of course by a lot of people too, an oversight. So of course, I'm sure as many of you know, the Beijing Olympics are just around the corner. And first, I want to say and commend the number of countries who have chosen to boycott the Olympics this year. I believe the list of countries could have grown from when I've recorded this and posted it, but as it stands right now, it's the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Canada recently decided to boycott the Olympics. The Chinese, diplomatically, anyways, to boycott the Olympics in Beijing. And even the NHL has recently said they're not letting any players attend the Olympics in Beijing as well. Now, this is a good thing, and I don't mean COVID. And there's been a problem with the Chinese government for a long time. And frankly, I think anyone who has a sense of moral conscience would avoid these Olympics, boycott it, don't watch it, don't post anything about it, and stay away from it. And frankly, any players attending, if they had any sense of moral conscience, they wouldn't attend these Olympics. No one would. Because it's really, what you're doing is you're promoting this country and allowing them to host it. And frankly, the fact that the Chinese were allowed to even host Olympics, it should be borderline criminal. Now, I'm sure some of you are looking at me with question marks thinking, is this just an anti-China rant or what? What's the point here? Well, I'll get into it right now. For those who may not know, and frankly, this is an issue why I'm talking about it today, and kind of taking a breath on the healthcare stuff and moving on to a very serious issue that is not talked about whatsoever. And if you do pay attention to certain media, or if you like to follow the House of Commons, certain MPs, for example, MP Garnet Janis, who's been a very heavy lead on this issue. But right now, the Chinese or at least the Chinese government, is in the midst of committing genocide. For those who don't, so this is about the Uyghur Muslims in China. Right now, the Uyghur Muslims in China, which are a minority group, are being persecuted, pretty much enslaved, put into concentration camps, as well as put into slave labor. And a lot of the products made in China are coming out of these provinces where the Uyghurs are being forced into slave labor, and it's a genocide. They're killing them off too. Now, it's disturbing to think that not only as a world organization like the Olympic Committee or whatever they're called can look this over, but I mean a lot of our governments look this over too. And right now, I mean, frankly, in the Canadian, let's look in Canada for instance, they outright refused to call what's happening to the Uyghurs genocide, when the definition of genocide matched what is happening to the Uyghurs in China. So the Chinese are committing genocide, and people were up. I saw a post from the NHL saying people were upset that NHL players couldn't participate. Some of them were saying they didn't want to go, and I'm hopefully thinking that's on the moral basis and not a basis of COVID. And we got to stop looking at, well, because of COVID, we probably shouldn't go there. So we should be thinking, well, they're committing genocide. We shouldn't go there. We shouldn't be doing anything for the Chinese government right now, because that's what Olympics really are, is really just promoting cities and countries and how great they are. And frankly, as I said before, no one should be watching these Olympics promoting them in any way. If you happen to be an Olympic athlete listening to this, I advise you, don't go. For the sake of the millions of Uyghurs being persecuted, hunted down, killed, forced into slave labor, and thrown into concentration camps. Because that's what's happening in China right now. We don't see it every day because the media would rather focus on people like Trump instead of people who are actually suffering in this world. For some reason, we think talking to an orange angry man is more interesting or more important than talking about a minority group literally in the middle of of a genocide in China. But I digress. But I mean, this has been an issue for a long time. I mean, this is not the first time the Chinese have really, let's say, overstepped their bounds. Let's look at even issues like the environment. The Chinese are the top emitters in the world, and yet we continue. The Canadian government in the last parliament, in fact, even sent materials to help build coal plants in China, while claiming that Canadian oil needs to end. We help build coal plants in China. So this is where it actually comes annoying on the sense of governments is they demand better of their people, but when it comes to the biggest emitters in the world, we still supply them with the materials to continue to be the biggest and continue to grow their emissions. Now, I'm not one for the environment, necessarily need to stopping all fossil fuels, but we need to take care of the environment the best we can without essentially strangling ourselves to death in a quick way. But still, we encourage countries like China to do whatever they want. And it's a point where we really need to look back to really need to look back to the examples of history. I mean, there's a reason the Allies didn't really push Germany back in World War II, right before World War II. And there was this time of appeasement because they wanted to avoid a war. Now, their reasons were they just got out of a world war and they didn't want to send young men back into war. But we're so far away from it now that we are appeasing the Chinese for not military reasons, for economic reasons. We've allowed China to become the biggest economy in the world, and now we rely on them for manufacturing. This has caused, of course, a lot of problems in our in our dealings with them. We allow them to have a permanent seat on the Security Council. Of course, that was way back when the Russians were demanding it. But back in like the 50s, 60s. But, I mean, we continue to encourage their behavior and say, well, we won't do anything. And we allowed them to grow this essentially this powerful and economically powerful as well, which we really need to start taking on the Chinese Communist government, because they have grown to a point of very dangerous size, and clearly we're willing to look away genocide just to get good deals on products. We even ship, this is the craziest part, folks, we ship raw oil to be refined in China to buy it back refined. We buy back our own oil, so they essentially for them to refine it. When just think of the cost of oil and gas if we refined it here in Canada. Think of the lowered costs it would be. We send our refined oils to places like China, the United States, and all these other places that have refineries. Guess who are the biggest people that fund our anti-oil measures? The United States is probably the number one who funds oil protesters and our resource development protesters. Because businesses are coming down to the United States instead. Unfortunately, you have governments like you have governments here in Canada that listen to these protesters who aren't Canadian, who are paid and come in internationally and talk on issues that they really have no business talking about. I won't even get you started on actors from LA coming up here and lecturing Canadians on their carbon emissions, when LA probably emits more emissions than Canada itself. Well, let's be honest. Actors themselves, individual actors, probably emit more carbon emissions than Canada itself. Let's be honest here. But back on course to the issue at hand that I really want to get discussing here. And it is a real problem when we think of this this red dragon that comes forth, and what we allow them to. And unfortunately, people like the Uyghurs are suffering, and we just turn a blind eye because it would be economically or even trade basis inconvenient for us to find another source for manufacturing, another source for refineries. I mean, if Canada refined its own oil and gas, we wouldn't need to send it to China to do that. And that's something we should really look into. But I mean, we don't, because we have trade deals, and we'd rather hold our trade deal with China and allow them to continue committing genocide and terrible acts and threatening countries like Taiwan and threatening countries like South Korea and India, just for a little bit of economic gain. And instead of finding new sources of manufacturing, finding new sources of able to refining oil and resources like that, and encouraging the Chinese to cut their coal, stuff like coal. Like, I believe the Chinese are some of the biggest coal users in the world. Funny enough, if we're looking at the environment, there are three countries that make up over 60% of carbon emissions. That means if the rest of the world, except the United States, China, and India, cut their emissions today, we wouldn't even hit 40%. Think about that. We wouldn't even hit 40% of the world's carbon if everyone in the world except these three countries cut their emissions to zero tomorrow. We wouldn't even hit 40%. China is about, I think, almost at 50% of the world's carbon emissions. It's pretty close. If not, let's just say let's say conservatively 40%. 40%. You add in India and the United States, you're over 60%. I mean, this is where we're at. Where China is becoming the biggest problem on multiple stages. But now the environment's just one example. I mean, let's come back to the Uyghur issue. They're committing genocide and we ignore it. Well, I shouldn't say we. Some of us want to actually stand up for this. But they bully countries like Taiwan. And they have endless feuds with, essentially every country in the world. I don't know a country in the world that would actually stand by China. Maybe North Korea. But other than that, I mean, maybe the Russians, depending on who the Chinese are wanting to piss off. It really depends. I mean, the Russian-Chinese border is one of the tensest borders in the world. Not the tensest. I believe that's, if I'm mistaken, that's Israel and everything neighbors. And South Korea, North Korea is definitely above that. I think they're fifth in the world for the most tense borders in the world. So, I mean, the Russians and the Chinese don't get along too well. They get along when it's convenient for them, but when there's no convenience in it, they don't get along. So, I mean, let's be honest. When big powerhouses have to come together, there's got to be one alpha. And I mean, that's kind of how we treat life, especially with human beings, right? Like, there's got to be a guy in charge. And it's not going to, and there's some people with the complex, and it's going to be me and no one else. I mean, that's what you get when you have governments run by Putin and the Chinese Communist Party. And you get them in a room together. They both want to think they're on top. I mean, even add the United States on that. Three of them get in a room. Each of them want to lead the summit. But that's the problem. We've allowed China to grow to this superpower status and essentially turn a blind eye, become an economic powerhouse. And yet we have people like LA actors and people like Greta complaining about Canada and the United States on their carbon emissions, but won't mention China, which I find very interesting. Now, the United States is pretty bad on emissions, I'll admit, but they're nowhere near China. And their use of coal is quite horrific, and they've even used emissions that have been deemed illegal by the United Nations. But they don't care. I mean, they don't really care. The question really needs to come to us is, how do we make the Chinese care about human rights, and how do we make them care about the environment? Well, economic sanctions. The Chinese are not going to do anything unless we stop using them and growing their economy. I mean, so the question I've gotten off of that response, because it's not the first time I've said that, definitely the first time I've said it on here, but not the first time I've said it to people. So usually the next question, which is a fair question, where do we get our manufacturing from? Where do, for example, canola farmers really rely on this kind of stuff? Well, we need to find replacements for that. I mean, if we look to India for manufacturing, they have a similar population base and manufacturing base, even though they are higher emitters. I think it would be willing to encourage them to go down if we trade more refined Canadian natural gas and start giving to the United States, China, and India. That can lower emissions. But I think we need to hold off on trade with China. How we get them to lower their emissions for right now is to limit their manufacturing and limit any business with them and limit any events with them, which is why I encourage people, don't support the upcoming 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. Don't watch it. Don't tweet about it unless you're tweeting about the Chinese genocide of Muslim Uyghurs. Because all we're doing is we're promoting, and I've known some people say, well, I'm just promoting the Olympics, not the Chinese. Well, when you do that, you're still promoting China, Beijing government, whatever you want to say, and it's still not right, no matter how you put it. And that's something I encourage everyone to do, is just don't watch it. And I'd even say to the athletes, don't participate. Not only have, especially the Canadian athletes, who they've imprisoned wrongfully 2 Canadians for years. And I like how, so I'm going to talk now about the 2 Michaels. We talked about the Uyghurs, but now let's talk about the Michaels. The Canadian government finally said they're boycotting. Great. But now I hear Canadian athletes saying they're going to go, even though they've wrongfully imprisoned 2 Canadians, to the 2 Canadian Michaels, and kept them there because we held someone who actually broke the law. This is the attitude we're supporting. Well, we need to accommodate the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist government. And we need to stop doing that. We need to stop trading with them. We need to stop, boosting their economy. We need to stop paying for their infrastructure projects, which I'm talking straight to the Canadian government at this point. Yes, last year in the last parliament, Canada directly paid for infrastructure, not just any infrastructure projects, coal plants. We paid for Chinese coal plants. Part of our infrastructure bank goes to the Chinese. Now, I'm don't make me think I'm not against for helping people with using our infrastructure, helping it to gain countries. China is one of the top economies in the world. They don't need our infrastructure money. They don't. They're not a third world country. Now, well, they don't have the money of a third world country. They sure treat their people. Like third world conditions. That's for sure. But I mean, welcome to totalitarian regimes where the people suffer, even though the government has the best economy in the world. Welcome to totalitarianism. It's how it works. People suffer under the weight and jackboot of of the dictators that run it, and the people suffer most of the time. I don't think I can give you one example where people flourished, the average person flourished under a totalitarian regime. If you can think of one, please let me know, because I'd love to look into that. But for examples, at least in modern day, that's clearly not true. So this begs the question, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? Because China is, as I said before, the red dragon. They're big. Because we've allowed them to grow that big through appeasement and because it was convenient. Mainly economically. And it's because of our economic reliance on China is the whole reason it's going to be very difficult to stop their growth, because we've become too self-reliant on them. We put too many eggs in that basket. And, we even saw this during the COVID pandemic when we were supplying vaccines. The Canadian government tried to rely on the Chinese for vaccines. And when they didn't come, where was our government? Scrambling. Because we put all our eggs in the Chinese basket, in the Chinese vaccine basket, and they didn't produce any. So Canada was very far behind on vaccinations. So there's that. We rely too much, and I think too many governments not just rely, but outright ignore atrocities these days. But for one reason, it's economically hard to do that. And of course, with the introduction of nuclear weapons. I'm not saying we need to go to war with China. I'm saying we need to use the same tactics they use against us. Economic dependence. Well, let's remove their economic dependence. And that's one of the solutions looking forward to. And that's probably the best way to handle this problem, is to look at this from an economic point of view and how we can attack from an economic point of view. And really try to cut the influence of this red dragon and cut it down to size. But I digress. uh, but we really need to. I think this is in this episode. What I'm really trying to get at is we really just need to be wary of what we're supporting nowadays. I very urge you, learn where your stuff's coming from. Products you buy. For example, Nike uses child labor to build their products. That's why I never buy anything Nike anymore. Because I don't want to support companies that do that kind of thing. That's why I try not to buy anything made in China, because most likely it's been made by the Uyghur, the persecuted Uyghur population. And just learn where your stuff's coming from and learn the history. There's a reason I also kind of try to avoid Ford. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I advise you look up Henry Ford. Not such a great dude. But, I mean, again, we can't always treat the modern day companies like their past companies. For example, I can think of a number of examples. But, we definitely have to look at what the companies you're buying with stand for. They might surprise you and might think, I'm never supporting this again. But don't just take a social media stance to continue to buy the product, because that won't do anything. My favorite part was, I can't remember the name of the company and the movement, why people were boycotting it, but I had a friend boycotting this thing. And it turned out he was continuing buying the product by slandering it on Facebook. Companies don't care if you slander them on Facebook as long as you're still buying the product. In fact, people who slander things on Facebook, you're really just promoting the thing. So frankly, I say don't even take to social media saying you're not even doing this thing, because you're giving them a sense of you're giving them a I'm losing the word, but you're promoting them in a way. You're still promoting them even if you're slandering them, because more people will look into them. That's what they want. That's what they want. So don't just go on social media. In fact, I'd say if you're going to not do anything anymore, don't even go on social media. Just stop using products. I can think of over the past years I've stopped using certain products. For example, I said Nike. I never buy a Nike product, and I'll never accept a Nike product. And I really would hope sports fans stop accepting endorsements from Nike and stop buying Nike products there. But Nike's probably too big and giving them too much money to do any of that, which is unfortunate. And there's a reason they have money. It's because they use child labor, very cheap child labor to build their products. And I'm sure a lot of clothing stores do that. And but the point is to just learn where you're getting your stuff from. And that's one point of challenging these issues is going forward. And this one's been a bit more political than past ones, I'll admit. And but it needs to be talked about. What's happening to the Uyghurs in China is not just criminal; it's outright genocide, as I've said before. And it's an issue we need to talk about, and it's an issue I think we need to start demanding of our politicians to take more seriously. Start demanding of our anyone who does dealings in China and our athletes in this upcoming Olympics to take seriously. And saying, that's great, you're going, if you want to go to China, fine. I'm not going to watch you, though. I'm not going to take part of the spectacle while genocide continues in this country. When they profit off of essentially, so the Uyghurs have become slaves in that country, let's be honest. And we should stop trying to profiteer on it. And I'd like to tip my hat off again to the United States, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom for boycotting the Olympics diplomatically anyways. I don't know if they'll still allow their I can tell you I would never allow any of my athletes under the Canadian flag to be going there, and I really hope these governments do that. And I tip my hat to anyone else since this has been posted and sent out to else who also boycotted the Olympics, because this is an Olympics we should not be celebrating, should not be participating in. And I advise you, don't watch them, don't tweet about them, at least positively anyways. And let's highlight saying, let's not support genocide. Let's not support the use of concentration camps to a group of people in China who are only there solely because of their religion. If that sounds familiar, I'll ask you to open your history books from 1939 to 1945. I don't think I need to say much more on that. But all I'm saying is, let's learn where our products are coming from. Let's learn what's happening in the world and not just blindly follow things because it's convenient or it'd be inconvenient not to. That's the problem. We're resurfacing ourselves in back in, if we really think it back into 1936 Europe. We're not doing this. We're allowing these things to grow because it would be inconvenient to try and stop them before they get too powerful. And we need to make sure that we're upholding, law, democracy, and basic human rights, especially as big Western countries like Canada and the United States. Because if we're not going to stand up, no one will. And the first way we do that is as people and citizens of these countries, we should demand of our representatives in Parliament, Congress, or whatever your government thing is, demanding them they take a stand diplomatically against these issues. And and if we continue to stand up and unmute these issues, let's hope they become more important. Anyways, I think that's been enough time talking about this, and I know, as I said, this has been a bit more political than they usually have been. Taking a break from the ALS stuff, but we will continue with that. But of course, this is more than just about ALS. This is about the unmuting the issues that are being muted or silenced, and of course, it fits that we're talking about totalitarian regime that tends to silence anything it doesn't like. For crying out loud. It's I can go into many examples of dictators silencing things they don't like, but that's essentially what we got here, and that's why this episode's perfect. With the Olympics coming around the corner, I encourage all of you, if you know any athletes going to the Olympics, tell them not to go. If you don't watch them, don't encourage this in any form, and just continue to stand up for basic human rights, and that's something the Chinese certainly do not allow of their citizens, and even go far to in camping them far off and using for slave labor. So let's continue to unmute this and many other issues in the future, and join me on cracking these issues on 10 in future episodes. Thank you very much. Have a great day.